Hello, everybody. Namaste, Hari Om. Namo Narayan. It's David G. Little, Swami Manamodi Saraswati. And now I'm doing Series 2 lecture on transmission science, week 4. So the week 4 lecture is called the Mid-Layer Gateway. This is the abstract for the paper. This lecture introduces the mid-layer gateway, the structural interface through which transmission enters the human system. The mid-layer gateway is neither cognitive nor transcendental. It is a developmental layer that becomes active only when the identity permeability has been established. So the identity permeability becomes very important. This manuscript outlines the architecture of the mid-layer, its relationship to the identity processor, and its role in transmission state cognition. Integrated case studies, including the 1988 balcony event and the 1989 Kriya initiation, illustrate the activation of the mid-layer in real transmission context. Section 1. Introduction. In Series 1, we mapped the human system using the vertical stack analogy. We identified the identity layer, the cognitive layer, the emotional layer, the perceptual layer, the mid-layer, and the higher order coherence layers. In Series 2, we focus on the mid-layer because it is the gateway through which transmission enters. The mid-layer is non-conceptual, non-narrative, non-emotional, non-symbolic. It is a structural interface, not a psychological state. Transmission cannot enter through the cognitive layer. It cannot enter through the emotional layer. It cannot enter through the identity layer. That's why they say that the ego is a hard nut to crack, but when it cracks, it enters. It enters through the mid-layer gateway. This lecture explains what the mid-layer is, how it becomes active, how transmission interacts with it, how it stabilizes, how it develops over time. 2. The architecture of the mid-layer. The mid-layer is the intermediate interface between the identity processor, which is lower, and the coherence layers, which is higher. It is the layer where perception becomes non-conceptual, identity becomes permeable, cognition becomes receptive, coherence becomes perceptible. 2.1. The mid-layer is non-cognitive. The mid-layer does not think. It does not interpret. It does not analyze, meaning it's beyond the mind, right? So the conscious mind that analyzes everything switches off. It receives. 2.2. The mid-layer is not emotional. The mid-layer does not feel in the emotional sense. It does not generate affect. It registers. 2.3. The mid-layer is not identity. The mid-layer does not create narrative. It does not maintain continuity. It opens. 2.4. The mid-layer is a structural interface. The mid-layer is the gateway through which transmission enters, coherence stabilizes, mid-level information is perceived. It is the most important layer in Series 2, the mid-layer. 3. Activation of the mid-layer gateway. The mid-layer becomes active only when the identity processor becomes permeable. So that's the most important part, permeability. All right. This is why week 3 precedes week 4. Activation occurs through identity softening, right? The ego, identity. Narrative reduction, perceptual widening, coherence sensitivity, field contact. 3.1. Identity softening. When identity rigidity decreases, the mid-layer becomes accessible. 3.2. Narrative reduction. When the narrative I stops dominating perception, the mid-layer opens. 3.3. Perceptual widening. When perception expands beyond the narrow cognitive frame, the mid-layer activates. 3.4. Coherence sensitivity. When the system becomes sensitive to coherence, the mid-layer becomes receptive. 3.5. Field contact. Transmission events often trigger mid-layer activation. 4. Case study, the 1988 balcony event. The 1988 balcony transmission is one of the clearest examples of mid-layer activation in my developmental arc. 4.1. Standing on or sitting on the level 6 balcony, I experienced a sudden field level contact, a coherence beam entering the system, a complete bypass of narrative identity. This is transmission. 4.2. Mid-layer activation. During the event, the identity layer dissolved, meaning ego. Ego dissolved. The cognitive layer quietened. The emotional layer stabilized. The mid-layer opened. This allowed the transmission to enter directly. 4.3. Why this matters. This event permanently activated the mid-layer gateway. It prepared my system for the 1989 Kriya initiation, the 1997 Rikia transmission, the later coherence states, and my current transmission role. 5. Case study, the 1989 Kriya initiation. The 1989 initiation is another example of mid-layer activation. 5.1. The event. During the initiation, the system entered a heightened coherence state, a non-conceptual awareness, and a field-level resonance. So you've got to get your head around, maybe you don't know, coherence and resonance. 5.2. Mid-layer dynamics. The mid-layer opened, stabilized, received transmission, integrated the field contact. 5.3. Developmental consequence. This event Strengthen the mid-layer gateway, making future transmissions, the events, more accessible. 6. The mid-layer and transmission reception. Transmission enters the system through the mid-layer. This is the core mechanism of transmission science and Series 2. 6.1. Why transmission cannot enter through identity. Meaning if you're into personality cult transmission, identity is narrative based. Transmission is non-narrative. Identity blocks transmission. Why transmission cannot enter through cognition. Cognition interprets. Transmission bypasses interpretation. Cognition distorts transmission. 6.3. Why transmission cannot enter through emotion. Emotion reacts. Transmission is non-reactive. Emotion destabilizes transmission. 6.4. Why transmission enters through the mid-layer. The mid-layer does not interpret, does not react, does not narrate. It receives. This is why it is the gateway, receiver. 7. Stabilization of the mid-layer gateway. Once activated, the mid-layer must stabilize. Stabilization occurs through 7.1. Repeated transmission contact. Each transmission event strengthens the gateway. 7.2. Coherence practice. Coherence stabilize the mid-layer. 7.3. Reduction of identity dominance. The less that identity dominates, meaning the ego, the more stable the mid-layer becomes. 7.4. Developmental integration. Over time, the mid-layer becomes a permanent interface. This is the goal of Series 2. 8. The mid-layer in the QEEU canon. The mid-layer is central to the transmission field, the Kriya Yuga philosophy, the transmission state cognition, and lineage-based development, and the activation of higher layers. It is the structural foundation of the entire transmission series. 9. Conclusion. The mid-layer gateway is the structural interface through which transmission enters the human system. It becomes active only when identity permeability has been established, and it stabilizes through repeated transmission contact. This lecture has shown the architecture of the mid-layer, the mechanisms of activation, the role of identity permeability, the dynamics of transmission reception, and the case studies demonstrating mid-layer activation. The mid-layer is the gateway to transmission state cognition. Next week, we explore the coherent states and field stability, the structural environment in which the mid-layer operates. The key terms: mid-layer gateway, the interface for transmission reception, identity permeability, the reduced narrative dominance, the coherent state, a stable, non-conceptual information state, the transmission field, a coherence-based field of information. the lineage transmission, field level contact across generations. Cross references are week 1, the transmission field. Week 2, the Kriya Yuga philosophy. Week 3, the identity processor and permeability last week. Thank you, everybody. That was week 4, the mid layer. Hari Om, Namaste, Namo Narayan.